Today is Tuesday, April 19th. The year is 2022. This is an emergency transmission. The Biden administration is coming for your guns. There's a dumb one.
Yo.
Dude, yes.
There he is.
Oh, dude, that's a nice fish.
That's a nice fish.
Welcome back, folks, for another episode of the Amazing Outdoors podcast. I am Brian Mays. You are listening to episode 51. Today's guest is Mark Jones. He is the Director of Hunter Outreach for Gun Owners of America. We have a call to action. The Biden administration, through executive fiat, just released new guidelines regulating ghost guns. On face value, you might think this is a good thing. Some of you more apathetic folks might even support what he's doing. However, there's a lot more to this ghost gun executive order. Mark Jones of Gun Owners of America is our guest today. Mark and I recorded this podcast about a week before this executive order came down from the Biden White House. Mark is the National Hunter Outreach Director for GOA. The podcast is mostly about GOA's Hunter Initiative. The Second Amendment isn't about hunting, but hunters should be about the Second Amendment. Due to recent developments since our recording, Mark called in to the show for a quick update on what is going on with this ghost gun executive order. With that said, I am going to condense today's show notes. Number 1, patreon.com/amazingoutdoors. $5 gets you a free hat. There's a few left. Early access to episodes and mostly ad-free. You also get one entry per month to June's Upland Outfitter Pants giveaway. You do not need to be a member for every single month. You can just join for 1 month. You can get a free hat and get an entry into June's drawing. But if you wanted to join now, you have the opportunity to get 3 entries into June's drawing. That's April, May, and June. 3 chances to win a $200 pair of hunting pants. Your cost is $15 and you get a free hat. That is a killer deal. You should really take advantage of it. Check it out. Patreon.com/amazingoutdoors. Number 2, sponsors of this program: Sport Dog and Upland Outfitters. Number 3, if you wanted to come float and fish Wisconsin's premier rivers this year with me for muskies and smallmouth, hit me up, brian@amazin.com. I will give you 25% off any listed price on the internet, but you have to get in touch with me directly. Bookings are filling up fast for May and June. Still some openings for July and August. You can hit me up at brian@amazin.com. Number 4, check out episode 45 with the Minnesota Sharp-Tailed Grouse Society. The Spring Fling and Double Gun Shoot is going on at the end of April. I will be there. It is on the 30th to be exact. Location is at Wings North in Pine City, Minnesota. For more information about the Double Gun Shoot and the Spring Fling, check out the show notes for the link to Minnesota Sharp-Tailed Grouse Society's Facebook page. So today is structured slightly different. The next 10 minutes, the first 10 minutes of the show, was a call-in from Mark, post our recording of the podcast. He wanted to give us an update on what's going on with this new ghost gun executive order from the Biden administration. Then we will transition into the main part of the show, where Mark and I get into a bit more about Gun Owners of America and Mark's background. Mark has an extensive background in wildlife management, and specifically Bobwhite Quail. I struck a nerve with one of my questions. Turns out Mark and some wildlife professionals are actually putting together a rebuttal to a recent publication that kind of asserted that Bobwhite Quail would be doing much better off if they were in the Migratory Bird Treaty Act. And that particular publication was very influential to my opinions on Old Gentleman Bob. So it was very interesting to hear from Mark. We tried not to go too far down that rabbit hole because the publication is not out yet. Mark will be coming back to talk about that publication and specifically this Bobwhite Quail Migratory Bird Treaty duck stamp kind of correlation that has been floating around the community for about a year now. I'm super excited to have him back and get a differing opinion. I think that's all how we educate ourselves. And I think today with science and trust the science, I think it's very paramount to hear different opinions. Mark is a passionate hunter and a Second Amendment advocate. I really can't encourage people enough to go check out Gun Owners of America. They are a awesome Second Amendment advocate group, and they don't just handle gun. Mark will get into some of this in the show. They have been fighting for all of our hunting rights and our hunting tradition. And as hunters, I think we have a awesome opportunity to band together and be a huge voice for gun rights in this country. Enjoy the show. Mark, I'm glad to have you back. You know, I don't typically have returning guests this quickly before I even release our first show. So we've had some kind of critical mass things happen recently. Biden administration introducing some new gun control laws, and it was very timely to our podcast. So I thought it would be good to kind of get you on to have this call to action and at least educate us quick, and then the listeners can kind of dive into the rest of our podcast.
Yeah. Well, thanks, Brian. You know, it's important to point out it's not legislation, it's an executive order because Biden is afraid to take this to Congress.
Is that exactly what it is? I again, clarification, I think is great here because there's a bunch of misinformation.
It's an executive order and ATF rules that come with that order, not legislation passed by Congress. And essentially what the Biden administration is trying to do is to do away with what he's calling ghost guns, and that's really a pejorative term. He's talking about homemade firearms, and it's important for listeners to understand that homemade firearms have been made by Americans since Jamestown, since the Pilgrims, for over 400 years. So it is pretty precedent setting to try to regulate those. And the other thing that this ATF rule that's been issued will allow is for additional records to go into the illegal gun registry. Keeping a registry of gun owners is illegal in this country, but ATF is doing that, and this will expand that. So I think that's the two critical points here for people to understand. It's for the first time in our nation's history, they're going to regulate homemade firearms, and they're going to continue to keep an illegal registry of gun owners.
Well, and from what I'm reading through what we already kind of know, and I don't know how much of all of this has been fully publicly released yet, but, you know, we're going to have to go through background checks potentially to go get gun repairs or buy small components to fix a currently owned firearm that we have. To me, that seems very, very, very overwhelming and a very tyrannical type reach into every facet of the gun industry, because anytime you get the government involved in anything like this, it costs more for the people. You know, these are all these death by 1,000 cuts that we kind of talked a little bit on the podcast, but this is kind of full front. I mean, it's coming from every aspect then of the firearm industry. It sounds like more or less they're trying to implement background checks on private, more or less law-abiding citizens. And the staggering part for me was looking at the statistics, and yeah, some of these ghost guns are involved, but the rise in crime isn't because of these ghost guns.
And, no, it's not, and that's a false flag argument. That's a false flag argument by the Biden administration.
Well, and it's a typical kind of just any kind of government, federal government. You know, they can't let any good crisis go to waste.
And what we're going to do, I think, to get to the crux of the issue, you know, we will probably go to court over this, just like we did over the bump stock ban, because it is an unconstitutional executive order. And there's also a provision called the Congressional Review Act where the Senate can force a vote on this. And I want to be sure to clarify this point. This is an executive order. This is done through the executive branch and ATF. But the Senate, under the Congressional Review Act, can vote on this, and we're going to try to force a vote in the Senate because our elected officials should be making these types of decisions, not the executive branch, not unelected bureaucrats and ATF. So Gun Owners of America intends to try to use the Congressional Review Act to try to pressure senators to vote on this issue. The elected representatives of the people should be voting on this. So those are the two things people can look for. They can look for, hopefully, action in the Senate to try to override this, and they can look for action in the courts because it is unconstitutional. And that's pretty much the bottom line right there, Brian. We've got two paths forward, one through the Senate and one through the courts.
Sure. Real quickly, I know you're busy and you only had a few minutes here for this kind of update, but what does this mean to the average hunter? You know, if we're not able to stop this currently?
Well, I think what hunters need to understand, this death by 1,000 cuts, sometimes they think these things don't apply to them. Like, for example, the bump stock ban that we've already gone to court over and won. And this issue is kind of the same way. You may not think it impacts you. You may say, well, I don't make a firearm at home. Well, keep in mind that if they can do one thing that infringes on your rights through executive order today, they can do another thing next month, next year. And in addition to that, they're going to be continuing to expand their illegal gun registry. It's illegal. The Congress said it was illegal to keep a registry of gun owners, and Biden and his administration is doing just that. So that's the message to hunters. This may not impact your ability to hunt right now with your favorite weapon, but if they can take away one right today, they can take away another right next week or next month. And we've seen that with bump stock. We've seen that now with this rule.
And I'd add a little bit more to it. So it's already hard for me to get my side-by-side shotgun work done. It's already super hard. There's only a few guys that actually have the jigs and the equipment to be able to really do what needs to be done to it. And if these laws get enacted, there's going to be fewer of those guys because of the hoops that they have to jump through to be able to do their job. And it's just, again, a death by 1,000 cuts. And this is meant to snuff out these little guys and all these small places that still are able to service customers that may have unique old firearms or just any purpose, really. But truly,
I couldn't agree more, Brian.
The hunters need to understand it. You got an old gun and you love hunting with it. This is going to kill your opportunity to be able to get that gun fixed if it gets broken in the future. Bottom line.
Yeah, that's a great point. And I've got to go here for another meeting, but you're absolutely right.
The last thing I wanted to ask
death by 1,000 cuts.
Last thing, how can people take action today? Is there a specific link I can include in the show notes so they can click there and donate and then get involved? I know I got all the hunter links, but is there anything specific to this?
Well, they can go to gunowners.org. We've got a lot of information on our website about this. They can call their senators, their United States senators. Every state's got two, and encourage them to force a vote on this under the Congressional Review Act.
And what do you say really quickly to a guy like me who's got two Democrat senators in my state who they're 100% favor this? What do I do?
To put pressure on, change them out when you get a chance in the election.
I know.
But put pressure on them. And I don't want to, if you're in a state like West Virginia with Joe Manchin or a state like Arizona with Kristen Sinema, there's a chance those senators might do the right thing on this. If you've got a senator that's so bad, then you need to change them out in the next election. But particularly if you live in a Republican or a state with Republican senators, you definitely want to be contacting them.
Absolutely. I couldn't agree more. It doesn't hurt to call the senator for the state you like to hunt in the most either. So
yeah, absolutely. Well, and I'm going to say, don't give up on the Democrats. Maybe some of them will do the right thing on this. Because
I'm in Minnesota here, so I'm not going to hold my breath. But They'll get a phone call.
Yes, well, and here we hope some Democrats will come along with this issue because again, I think it bears repeating. Biden is doing something through executive action that he can't do through Congress, and Congress should have to act on this. The Senate should have to vote
Just
on
the
it.
presidential precedent that it sets is something that needs to get acted on, regardless of what the actual legislation, the effect is on us without the legislation. So couldn't agree more, Mark. I'm going to get on to the rest of the podcast, and thanks very much for calling in and giving us a quick update on what's going on here.
Hey, thanks for having me, Brian, and we'll talk soon.
Sounds good. All right, ladies and gents, before we get back to the second segment of this show, just a quick reminder. Check out patreon.com/amazingoutdoors. I want to get you a hat, $5. Got a few left. On with the show. All right, folks, we are back for another episode here at the Amazing Outdoors podcast. I have an awesome guest today. Big passion of mine, Mark Jones from the Gun Owners of America Association. Mark, welcome to the podcast. Thanks for coming on the show.
Well, thank you, Brian. I really appreciate you bringing me on the show this morning.
Well, you know, I find it very timely that I had stumbled across the announcement of your position at Gun Owners of America. And when I reached out, I was very intrigued by both your credentials and background, but also what you're doing for GOA now. So can you give us, the listeners, a little bit of insight into your background and kind of what led you up into becoming, you know, a hunting advocate for Gun Owners of America?
Sure, Brian. You know, in my current role, I'm a national director with Gun Owners of America for our hunter outreach and hunter programs. But my background, I spent almost 3 decades in a state fish and wildlife agency. I'm still a certified wildlife biologist. And I've also been a hunter since I was a little boy. So kind of have a personal background and interest in hunting and was blessed to work with hunting and hunting issues for a career, you know, in a state fish and wildlife agency. So that's kind of the background I bring to GOA. Been here for almost a year, and am trying to build hunting programs within Gun Owners of America.
So, wildlife biologist, you know, in our pre-call, I had learned that you had done some extensive work with Bobwhite Quail. And me personally, I have such a soft spot for our native game birds, and especially Mr. Gentleman Bob. Now, down in the Southeast, where I believe you mentioned in your pre-call you had done some most of your career, is a very unique dichotomy of situations. But you go across the country, and we have native game bird populations, and they all seem to tell a similar story. And it's kind of interesting to see, for me personally, how much limelight gets put on the pheasant and how much we don't care about our native game birds, in the sense that pheasants seem to steal the most of the funding. How do you feel about that?
Yeah, wow, that's a big question.
And I'm sorry to throw you over the bus right away.
No, that's okay. Yeah, I worked as a research biologist for practically my whole career, or as a supervisor of research biologists. And actually in the South, there was a lot of money spent on bobwhite quail research. And
I kind of tried to, and I probably didn't explain it very well. The Southeast and the Southeast region, you know, has the largest density of quail forever chapters. So there is money in that specific area for quail, but that's really the only native game bird they have down there.
Well, there's ruffed grouse and but I think that there's been a lot of work done on quail, a lot of research done on quail. I think quail are just such a special case. They're such habitat specialists and require very specific habitat. They're well, and pheasants do as well to some extent. So
Yeah, they do, but they're not. They don't seem to be as sensitive as quail. Where,
yeah,
quail need, let's just say, for the lack of, or for the sake of an argument, they need 3 components of habitat. Pheasants could survive in one. Okay,
yeah,
they're not going to flourish like they could if they had all 3 components, but quail won't survive if they don't have all of those. They're that indicator species per se.
Yeah, and quail, you're in Minnesota, I think. Is that correct?
That is
So
correct, yeah.
you're a little bit far north for quail. I guess there's probably maybe a handful in the southern part of Minnesota, and
Southeastern
yes,
Minnesota still has a wild
yeah,
population, and Southwest Wisconsin still does, but neither one of our DNRs will do anything about it up here. They have more or less written the birds off from a management standpoint.
yeah. And I really don't know the specific reasons, but I know that in general, and I was involved in national committees and groups that worked on upland game bird issues. So I got some sense of what other states do and focus on. I think sometimes it's a matter of return on investment.
I agree with you 100%.
You can invest certain amount of management effort into something like pheasants in the northern states and get a better return than quail. Quail, because of changing landscape practices and landscape use and other factors, it's really hard to manage quail in some of the northern states these days. And I can give you an example, West Virginia. I remember them sending their biologists to some of the meetings, and sometimes he questioned whether they could even manage quail anymore in West Virginia other than as a non-game bird or as a songbird. And they chose to focus on ruffed grouse. And so it's kind of I guess not trying to defend the agencies, but just pointing out a lot of times there's limited resources, and it's kind of return on investment. Where do you invest your time and effort? If I was in Minnesota and I was running Minnesota DNR, I would probably invest my resources in ruffed grouse and ringneck pheasants, not bobwhite quail. Now, if you're in North Carolina, South Carolina, it's, bobwhite quail obviously is where you need to invest your efforts. So sometimes I think it just comes down to that. There's just limited manpower, limited money, and you've got to work with what you've got the most chance of having success with.
I agree, and I think that's kind of how we've gotten to this point if you want to take a stab at the general quail landscape of the United States here, especially bobwhite. I just kind of refuse to accept it, as a hunter and a conservationist, a growing conservationist. I'm still kind of a novice. I'm learning, but I just, they're there, especially here in Minnesota. We've got a Quail Forever chapter down in southeastern Minnesota, and they're not even listed. You can't hunt them. Wisconsin, you actually still has a bag limit on quail, but Minnesota, we've got a great chapter that has had private land and public land partnerships down there for a long while. And I don't know that it's a huntable population, but when they're not listed on, the state DNR as a game bird, they get less funding and they get less attention. And to me, it's just, I believe more in a holistic management approach than a species-specific management approach when it comes to like upland game birds. And I think that a lot of times the components that are needed to hold quail are almost all there, but nobody really thought about quail, and so they never put in the extra elements that quail need in some of these properties that they've really redone the landscape on and done the habitat work. But that's a whole rabbit hole we don't need to get down today. And I'm of the volition that if the bobwhite quail would have been on the Migratory Bird Treaty Act, I think we would see a lot different landscape for bobwhite quail hunting today. I think that
And
the
see, I
funding
don't buy
mechanism
that.
that duck hunting has provided wetlands is amazing, and I just think we kind of got left out of the boat a little bit with quail.
Yeah, that's an interesting point you bring up there. There was a recent paper published in about that issue where a couple of wildlife scientists made that case, and actually, you'll
I
find
read
this.
that paper, and that's
Well,
what
I'm
shaped
part of
my
a
opinion on
rebuttal,
it.
Brian. I'm part of a rebuttal to that.
Are you? Oh, that's
Yeah,
great, man. This is awesome.
I joined a professor from University of Georgia, one from Mississippi State, and a colleague of mine or a friend of mine from Virginia in writing a rebuttal to that because I believe that the paper was very flawed. The conclusions they made about the comparisons they made between ducks and quail, in my view and in our view in our paper, were quite flawed. I don't believe that quail being in the Migratory Bird Act or being managed under the Migratory Bird Treaty would have made the differences they assert.
Sure.
And that paper will be coming out in Journal of Wildlife Management, which is the premier publication, I guess, of the profession, sometime this year, I believe.
I'm ecstatic to read it because
Yeah,
that's how we reread things, we consume information, and that's how we develop our own opinions. And that was a very strong paper for me. And I spent a lot of time after reading that article in the vehicle in upland game bird country. And it was a lot of time behind the wheel where I was reflecting and going, but it was a situation where it was a hindsight, and you always seem to have better clarity when you can look back than you do looking forward. And at today's juncture, we just have to look back and try to learn those lessons and try to implement things to not repeat the same mistakes over. And I felt that there was a missed opportunity there with quail, that they maybe got left out of some of like the northern states and just some of the fringe areas where maybe we could have managed things a little bit better. The conclusions drawn of the article that you're talking about, I don't know that I buy in completely to the findings, but I do buy into the fact that I think we could be sitting in a better position today. How much better? I don't know.
Yeah,
But
I think we could be sitting in a better position, but I think where the authors missed the mark, and I'd be happy to come back maybe when our paper's published.
oh,
Maybe you have a
please, I would
chance to
love
read
to
it.
have this discussion
We could have
specifically, man.
but I think their first flawed point was their comparison of ducks and quail is just the biology of the animal is just so different. You can't even, it's comparing apples to oranges. You got a migratory species in a duck that nests in a wetland, that moves around and where you can manage relatively small on a landscape wetlands and have a big bang for your buck versus a species like quail that is not migratory, that is widespread across the landscape, that has very different habitat requirements. That was their first major flaw, is just that whole apples to orange comparison. And then
And that makes a lot of sense.
A lot of their assertions about habitat and the way habitat's been managed and what's impacted the landscape were not right. Particularly their assertion that about the federal involvement, where it would have made all these differences, because the way the feds manage ducks and the way quail have to be managed are very different in terms of scale, in terms of the impact on agriculture, farming, where people live. There was also some issues. I tell you what, let's plan to come back when our paper's out, because
no, I would really like that. I think
the biggest thing they glossed over in their paper was federal ag policy has actually been detrimental to bobwhite quail populations.
100%, yeah.
So the assertion that if the feds had been involved through the Migratory Bird Treaty in leading the effort doesn't really stand the smell test. We could have certainly made improvements and need to in federal ag policy going forward. But they completely glossed over the detrimental impacts of federal ag policy on bobwhite quail for the last 50 to 60 years. So it was just, I thought it was a very poor paper. And our rebuttal in the Journal of Wildlife Management will reflect that. I'd love to come back and talk with you about that when it's available.
Open invitation, because that paper impacted me big time as I was launching this podcast. And I would love, I'm not the type of person that my opinion can't be changed. And I love to find opposing viewpoints, because that's where, the truth lies. Is somebody makes an assertion, you got one side on, I'm not talking politics here, but one guy on the right, one guy on the left, and, the truth is mostly in the middle somewhere,
Well, that's what science is all about, is about debate and
exactly.
question. And that's one of the, I will get political. One of the problems I have with some of the recent federal guidelines and narratives is that they're saying you can't question science. That is the definition of science. You question, you try to replicate other people's work. You're constantly evolving. Science is never settled. It's always changing.
Well, I was taught in botany in college that science is nothing more than a hypothesis, an educated guess backed up by data that you can put forward and make an assertion. Well, it is absolutely the duty of other scientists to, like you say, replicate that or prove it wrong. That is how we actually fundamentally find middle ground politically and the truth. Bottom line,
Yes.
We are very opinionated creatures as human beings, and you can take two people to the same place and sit down with them independently afterwards, and you have two different stories about their experience.
Yes.
And life is a compilation of experiences, and politics is a meddling in that and trying to kind of bring civility to all the chaos. But man, it has been really a bunch of bullshit lately. I'm sorry. I'm right there with you. I have not been a fan of any of the messaging coming out of our almighty federal government as of late, because it is absolutely against everything that we have fundamentally built our kind of society on, more or less.
Brian, I've published a number of peer-reviewed scientific papers in the last 30 years, and I was always, the mantra in the profession, the wildlife science profession, is always that your work had to be able to be replicated by another scientist and checked. And when an entity tells you, like we've been told for the last couple of years, this is the science, don't question it, red flags go off in my head.
I've heard way too much. The science is settled.
Right. Science is never settled. Science is constantly changing, constantly evolving. Gravity is settled. If you jump off a building, you're going to fall to the ground. That's settled. But most
it's a
things
law
are
of
not
nature.
settled.
That's not science.
Yeah, that's physics.
Oh man. Well, because we got a little bit political here, I want to jump back just a little bit, because we kind of stole all of your background about Bobwhite Quail, and I really think that the first part of this podcast is really interesting. I'm super excited to have you back on the show for that specific topic about funding and the federal involvement of quail in the Migratory Bird Treaty Act and that publication. So as soon as you get that published, if you would not mind sharing with me and letting me know, and we can put something on the calendar for that.
Sure, absolutely. Would love to.
Awesome. So what else did you get into, and kind of maybe what are some highlights or interesting studies that you've done as a wildlife professional in managing different critters? Because I think you mentioned something about doing some research on black bears as well.
Yes, I did. I worked on black bears for a better part of 20 years. I really was blessed to work with a lot of different animals. Quail, as we've already talked about, otters, bears. Bears were one of the more interesting, I guess, highlights of my career. Started in the early 90s in areas of the southeastern coastal plain where, frankly, at the time, experts thought bears would never persist to today. And actually, they've thrived for the last 30 years. But at the time, we didn't know that. And started out doing a lot of research, radio collaring, and researching all aspects of bear biology and management, and worked with bear habitat use, bear reproductive biology, the way, hunting mortality and how to manage that. And we were quite successful. I mean, lots of people were involved in it, but in eastern North Carolina now today, there's some of the strongest bear populations in anywhere, some of the biggest bears anywhere. But so that was kind of a neat aspect of my career, was having that opportunity to work with black bears from 30 years ago when they were perceived to be going away or headed towards extirpation, to today to where they're just super abundant and a really highly prized big game resource, So I kind of lived that whole process.
Those are always exciting stories. I mean, I had one of the Wisconsin ecologists. He's a bird ecologist on, and we have up here just a great success story of the trumpeter swan. And so it's always really interesting to hear good success stories, because I think it's so easy in wildlife management today and as a hunter to blame the state or the DNR or declining populations. And I mean, I hear it from my uncle is a perfect case for it. I go down to Florida and go to the Sebastian Inlet, which is just an epic fishing area in Florida. And well, that snook used to do cartwheels through the inlet, and you don't see those 50-pounders anymore, or 50 inchers anymore. And it's just, it ain't like the old days. And, part of that's true. There are more people and less resources, but at the same time, there are people like yourself and great wildlife professionals out there who are turning the tides on a lot of these species and having success. So it's always interesting to hear. When you guys were doing that research on black bears, were you using like original kind of old school radio telemetry collars?
Mm-hmm. We were. This was in the days long before GPS technology.
Yeah. So you were tracking around little radio receivers through the woods, looking for a beep and.
Yeah, these were directional collars. So you had to take, you had to do what we call triangulation. You had to take you had to take an angle compass bearing from one spot, and you had to move, take another one to kind of get an estimated location on the bears. And I remember when the first GPS technology came out, it was so funny. Some of the younger listeners might get a kick out of this. Everybody's now used to having this on their phone, but the military controlled all that. And when the first GPS technology came out, we started experimenting with it, and we had to correct our locations because the military jammed the locations, I guess, because they were afraid foreign governments might use the GPS technology for military strikes. So the data we originally got was not where the animal actually was, and that was intentional. It had to be corrected. And
yeah, I recall hearing some stuff about how the original data it was off by there was like a calculation or a formula that you could use to actually get the correct location, but it was publicly off.
It was off publicly, and the devices the devices we used were so massive, you mounted them on your vehicle. Nowadays, people carry a smartphone in their hand that has Google Maps and technology on it. We had to mount it on a vehicle to connect with the satellites, and then it was inaccurate. It had to be corrected. I mean, it was really a neat time in history. I'm old enough to have remembered that.
Well, I personally came out of the electronics manufacturing realm, and there's a fairly decent there's a couple companies up here that are fairly sizable and entangled in the wildlife management space who build telemetry collars for all kinds of different wildlife animals. And I did some work with him. So I was kind of personally tied to some of the progression in that space. And when I professionally started in my career 20 years ago, the battery life and I did a lot of work with batteries over my years, and just watching that progression, and then watching the progression of microchips and the data and the analytical side of things that has come off of those systems that are now being implemented. And then now finally starting to see organizations use that data. To me, I saw it happen in the professional and industrial side of things through like fleet management and other things, and the efficiencies that were driven to corporations because they were able to pull metrics off of their machines. We were working with a company at one point that was building ice machines, and they'd have like 80 of these things in a hotel, and for a casino hotel, big one out in Vegas. And the thing goes down, the guy's got to go out, diagnose it, all this stuff. And we'd put in 80 points of metrics into these things, and the guy knew before the transformer was going to blow on it. So he'd just go out and replace the transformer and just stay ahead of the game. And it brought a lot of great decisions to the business community. I really have seen some great decisions, I think, over the last decade because of technology introduced into wildlife management space. And to me, it's very exciting because I think the tip of the iceberg is yet to fully be seen. And there's a whole lot more there that I think can be utilized to help drive better management practices in the future.
Absolutely. Yeah. And of course, technology in the wildlife profession has become so important. With all the new sets, technology allows learning things about animals, in new ways. And things are still not perfect, and animals are amazing. There's still so much we don't know, but boy, technology has surely played a role in changing wildlife research.
Yeah, I kind of think about it earlier. We talked about, you had mentioned the reason why some of the bobwhite quail has maybe kind of left the management space here in the northern states because of resources and people, and the just difficulty that is to manage quail in these states. I do think long term that technology is going to be what saves it and brings the efficiencies, because I think technology is going to be able to allow you, instead of throwing a dart at the wall and hoping to hit the dartboard, now you're throwing a dart at the bullseye and hitting the dartboard at least. You know what I mean? It's bringing the little bit of resources that you have and that you can use. Now you're using them in the most efficient manner based on real data, which is very important, because you can piss up wind all day long and not change anything, or you can, do something. And pushing water uphill it doesn't work. So.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Well, I guess real quickly, I'd like to take a break here in a couple minutes, but before we do that, I'd like to transition at least the listeners into your role with GOA, and how did you go from, living out east in southeast, and now living out in the beautiful state of Wyoming and working with hunters on the backside more of some of the wildlife stuff that you've done in the earlier part of your career?
Yeah, I was always politically active, both in my professional duties. I had a lot of jobs that required political interaction, and also personally. And when I had an opportunity to retire, and I was looking for a role like this where I could kind of combine my background and my love for politics and freedoms and liberties and things like that. And well, this was the perfect role for me. GOA wanted to establish a more of a role in the hunting community, and I had a background in that, and also a love for the Second Amendment, and a love for being engaged in the political process. So it was a natural fit. And as far as Wyoming, I'm a national director. I probably could have lived anywhere, but I'd been coming to Wyoming for 34 years before I moved here, hunting, fishing, recreating, and had always intended to retire to Wyoming. So the it was kind of a personal preference in some respects, but it's also a great place to be as GOA's, national hunting director, because hunting is such an important part of life in the, northern Rockies and northern plains. But I've got a national role. I'm going to Texas in a few days, and
couldn't have picked a better state that believes in fundamental gun rights.
Yeah, Wyoming's good when it comes to gun rights, as most of the neighboring states are as well. And so it's been a great transition for me. I've loved the opportunity now to combine several of my passions and work for the Second Amendment, try to engage hunters on behalf of GOA, and we're doing some exciting things that I think can, help hunters be more engaged in their battle for our rights. And I'm kind of excited to talk about some of those things with you today.
Yeah, I'm very excited as well, because I also think that it's a two-way street. There's a lot that you guys could do for hunters, but I also think there's a lot that hunters can do for you.
Yeah, and for the Second Amendment in general, and for the hunting tradition, there's a lot hunters can do. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, and I think a lot of us hunters, there's a portion of us who are very politically active, and then there's a fair amount of apathy towards the Second Amendment issue personally. And that's what I see, and I think from just talking with other hunters about things. I'm of the volition, if the government can own it, then I should be able to own it, because I fundamentally believe the Second Amendment wasn't put here for hunting. It was put here as a deterrent from any type of tyrannical government, and then also foreign invasion. So, and I believe that was a fundamental God-given right to freedom. It is how man becomes free, is the way to defend himself in all situations, not just home protection, not just, from the crazy person. It's from all crazy, if you ask me, and all evil, and that's why I do think our founding fathers put this in. And I think they viewed that as, we look at a handgun in a woman's hand in a situation where she's maybe facing an aggressor, rapist, or something along those lines, and it's called the great equalizer. Well, you can put that situation at hand in any person. It doesn't have to be a woman. The roles could be anything. It is the great equalizer of freedom and protecting your life and liberty and the pursuit of happiness that this country offers. So I love this country, and I love our Constitution. And unfortunately, I've not got too political on this show, but I think the Constitution has been trampled on. And the Second Amendment is, as Ronald Reagan said, freedom is but only one generation away. And it's just, there's a lot of silos out there on a lot of these issues, and I think there's only one way to come together, and that's through a common cause. And I think the Second Amendment does that for GOA and hunters. So I'm really interested to get into this next part of the show with you. But let's just take a quick break and regroup here, Mark. If you don't mind, you have anything else to say quick? Otherwise, we can take a quick break.
Yeah, that sounds good. I'll comment on what you said and we come back. But I agree. The Second Amendment means what it says and says what it means, and it's absolute in our view, in GOA's view. And our motto for the hunting program is that the Second Amendment isn't about hunting, but hunters should be about the Second Amendment. And maybe we can talk about what that means when we come back.
Absolutely. Let's take a quick one and we'll dive into that.
Sounds good.
All right, folks, before Mark and I finish up this podcast, check out the show notes for the Double Gun Spring Fling with Minnesota Sharp-tailed Grouse Society. It is happening next week. I will be there. And also, please consider contributing to the Gun Owners of America. All right, we are back for part 2 and the meat and potatoes of today's show. So, Mark, why don't you kind of get into Gun Owners of America and specifically the mission of what you're doing here?
Sure, Brian. So our hunter program called Second Amendment Hunters, its motto is that the Second Amendment isn't about hunting, but hunters should be about the Second Amendment. And to kind of put that in perspective, the United States has got about 15 million licensed hunters, according to recent estimates. There's another couple million that hunt that don't have to have licenses. And hunters represent a powerful voting group who can and should stand as, strong supporters and protectors of our constitutional rights. And, some hunters in recent decades have been apathetic, not all. Some are very involved politically. But so our goal is to educate, or our goals, I guess I should say, are to educate and mobilize hunters, to be active Second Amendment supporters, to recruit hunters to become politically active, at the local, national, state, and national levels, to combat Second Amendment apathy within that segment of the hunting community that is apathetic, to demonstrate safe and ethical use of firearms in hunting, and perhaps as important as any of those, we want to protect the American hunting tradition and ensure hunting opportunities for all hunters. And if hunters are listening, I'm sure they understand that apart from the Second Amendment, the actual practice of hunting is under attack, in the United States. So that's a component of this as well. All those are kind of wrapped into a big idea of engaging hunters, involving hunters, and working with hunters to protect the American hunting tradition and our Second Amendment rights.
What a powerful lobbying mechanism, and really a cross-functional team of people that can be mobilized. You are right. I mean, there are hunting opportunities and fishing, but more specifically hunting opportunities today that basically just about every state is battling some issue related to hunting. And I look at kind of Wisconsin personally, where I was raised. I'm currently a resident in Minnesota. I'm trying to get back over to Wisconsin, but they've got a very unique case where we have a conservation Congress, where the people actually do have a say and an involvement at the ground level on trying to change some of our hunting regulations and things. But outside of that, there isn't a lot of groups that are really fighting for it all and encompassing and going to Washington. We've got all these silos of people out there. You've got your Pheasants Forever and all your habitat specialists, your Trout Unlimited, Quail Forever, Rough Grouse Society. But none of those groups really want to they don't want to touch the Second Amendment issue because of how politically charging publicly it is. And a lot of the public backlashing from the other side of the argument, who, I don't know, tends to be a little bit more threatening and tantrumy, if you want to, more childish in the way that they deal with things. I can see easily a habitat group like a Rough Grouse Society going, well, we are 100% support all guns, and I mean, I can just see the political backlash coming today. So it's very difficult for hunters to find an organization that really is fighting for them on all fronts, including the firearms. And I think you guys are a really unique case of that. I joined GOA a number of years ago when I kind of got sick and tired of getting this expensive public print from the National Rifle Association about hunters that didn't really have anything that I could afford as a hunter in it. We're talking about hunts in Africa. Well, the National Rifle Association, or National Rifle Association, is supposed to be about my hunting rights here in America. And I think anybody can pay enough to go hunt in Africa, and That's not anything to do with me here. And what I've noticed about GOA over the years, and I'll just say this, is I get basically a copy or printed newsletter from you guys. To me, my membership dues go a lot further to protect the Second Amendment rights and not to a bunch of publicity and attorneys and unrealistic publications that, to be honest with you, I don't think are doing a whole lot. And that's why I've personally supported you guys. I also support the Defenders Club and the Second Amendment Foundation. I'm a lifetime member there. I personally believe fundamentally that if I can't have a firearm, I can't do the things I love on a daily basis, or at least for like 6 months out of the year. Mm-hmm. So I think it's so important. How are you guys having success doing this, Mark? I mean, what are some of the big things that you guys have coming up this year? And there's more to this, just not the bullet points that you might see out there. So can you give us some examples of what you guys are doing?
There's a couple ways that Gun Owners of America has already really stood up for hunters' rights that most hunters probably don't even know about. And in the summer of 2021, in August, two radical environmental groups petitioned the federal government to restrict the importation of wildlife trophies from out overseas, but more impactful than that, they wanted to restrict the movement of meat and parts, carcass, let's say antlers, that type of stuff, across state lines within the United States. And this had nothing to do with chronic wasting disease. I don't want anybody to get confused about that. That's being handled already by the states. This was an attempt to use COVID as an excuse to really damage the American hunting tradition. And so let me give you an example of what this would have meant. Let's make sure we have a reason to cover the why and how we got there, though, because I do truly believe apathy and not being involved is the reason that they can slide a lot of this stuff under the radar and you don't know about it. And it's groups like you guys who are saving our ass. Yeah, well, what this group would have, you're from Wisconsin originally. Let's say you like to go home and hunt with your family, deer hunt, and you currently live in Minnesota. And I'm sure you would normally bring some of your meat back to Minnesota after you've hunted with your family. This would have stopped that. This would have stopped that, Brian, completely.
No quartered deer, no deboned meat, nothing? I couldn't bring it?
This would have stopped the movement of wildlife across state lines under the guise of COVID, under the guise of COVID problems.
So today we can't transport it across state lines due to CWD.
No, you can. You can take deboned meat.
Deboned and quartered meat. I can't take any spinal column.
You can take deboned meat. You can take clean skull plates. You can take antlers, finished antlers. This would have stopped the transportation, period.
Yep.
This would have stopped me from going to, I live in Wyoming and I love to pheasant hunt. I go to Kansas, I go to North Dakota. This would have stopped me from bringing my pheasants back.
That's crazy.
So I want everybody to understand this was not about chronic wasting disease. That is handled by the states now, and most hunters are okay with the way that's handled, with deboned meat, antlers, clean skull plates. This would have stopped more, it would essentially stopped you from being able to bring your meat back or your trophies, whatever. And it was a ridiculous effort by two radical environmental groups. And we fought that along with some other groups in the hunting community, and we're able to, at least for now, put a stop to that. Now that still hangs out there as a threat because the current presidential administration could theoretically act on that request. I don't think they will in an election year, but I just want hunters to understand that was a proposal. It was a serious proposal, and it still could be resurrected.
Yeah, and I don't care where anybody sits, but the people, I think every hunter that's a conservationist that supports a wildlife management group that wants the habitat better, we all want a better environment. So we tend to be people who are susceptible to, I guess you could say, environmental policy and planning, maybe, and which tends to be under this administration extremely liberal and green. And at the same time, you have to look at the people and their fundamentals and their character on, what their long-term policies are. These people are the type of people that don't want you to go into the woods, let alone bring an animal back. Some of them, not all of them, but some of the very, very fringe that are in these groups that you're talking about that proposing some of the things, they don't want us there. They don't believe that land is ours. They literally fundamentally believe it's the wildlife's.
Well,
and that's a huge difference. And being able to bridge that gap to fight these groups, to fight all the little attacks that come, I'm a common guy. I don't have time to be up to date on all of this information, and I don't get all of the good information today. We are censored 100% today. We don't get 100% accurate information. If you want to research something, you have to go out and do a ton more research than you've ever had to do before to find accurate information. And that's about everything. And you guys are fundamentally important at the legislative level for bringing these types of things to the public forefront so we know what's going on.
Yeah. And that what this group was essentially trying to do was severely damage hunting in America, because a very high percentage of hunters hunt across state lines. You probably go back to Wisconsin and hunt. I go outside Wyoming to hunt in 2 or 3 adjacent states. When I lived
hunt
back
4 or 5
South,
states every year.
Yeah, when I lived in the South, I went back to Virginia to hunt with my father. I hunted in adjacent states to where I lived. So that's a very common thing these days. This would have pretty much relegated the people to hunting around their house in their home state. And it was an intentional effort to severely damage the American hunting tradition. And I'm happy that we were able to be part of the groups that helped oppose it and help table it.
But you guys need more funding this has got to be coming from all kinds of different angles that are unrelated to guns, plus the gun issues.
Well, I think in some respects, I think it was primarily an attack on the American hunting tradition, but I think it was also a backdoor attack on gun rights, because if you're able to damage the hunting tradition, then you're able to damage
it just creates
the need
less
for
people.
firearms,
Yep.
the numbers of people coming into the firearm community, the numbers of people buying firearms. It's kind of death by 1,000 cuts. I think that was part of this.
Well, and I think that there is a long-term goal to disarm the American public. And I think it's just because it's an inherent nature of the progression of a government. It does get to the point where it becomes all-powerful, almighty. And it does things that they know the public aren't going to like. And you just look at all of the countries that have been disarmed through COVID and look at the fundamental differences in how the people were treated there and how they're being treated here. We didn't necessarily have, a beautiful thing here, but Australia was, you couldn't leave your house. They turned their guns in not too terribly long ago, if I recall my history correctly. So we have to look at these things, and I do truly believe that we are a strong group of people as Second Amendment supporters in this country and hunters together. They can't come after us directly because they won't win. So they have to go after us through the back door and inch away over time to degrade it enough that we're smaller than what we are today. I think that's the only way that the people that are opposing us, not necessarily all in government. There's a lot of opposing groups similar to GOA that don't want guns in this country.
Well, and I'll give you another example, Brian. In 2019, GOA fought against House Resolution 8. And for those that don't remember that or know what it was a law proposed by the Democrats in the House, and they've controlled the House now since 2018, I believe. And this was while Trump was president in 2019. And this Resolution 8 would have made it a criminal offense if you hand your gun to a hunting partner, and unknown to you, they don't have a hunting license, you become a criminal. Or if you hand your gun to a hunting partner who's a veteran, and unknown to you, the VA has stripped them of their gun rights, which is a terrible thing, and that's a whole other thing that we could do a whole show about, the way the VA's treated some veterans. But let's say you hand your gun to a veteran, and that veteran's been stripped of their gun rights by the VA, you're a criminal. This was an actual proposal in a 2019 law that the Democrats proposed in the U.S. House of Representatives, and we fought against that. So that's probably another little known way we fought for hunters without hunters even knowing about it. Unfortunately, with the current administration, we're going to see probably more of these types of things that we have to fight against in the future.
Absolutely. I believe it came right out of the mouth of him himself, but it's definitely come out of the administration, and especially after January 6th happened. If you're a Christian and believe in this Constitution and more or less a Bible thumping, gun toting American, there's been talk that we're terrorists, and I'm sorry, that's unacceptable. It's absolutely unacceptable. If you believe in this flag and this country and the Constitution, that you're labeled a terrorist by an administration of our government, that's tyrannical as far as I'm concerned. And I just don't foresee a government that is that radical and tyrannical stopping. I see them being even more vindictive and maniacal and finding ways to come after us in death by 1,000 cuts. It's just exactly what where the Democrat Party, I hate to say it, has gone at a national level.
Well, you're right.
And I'm sorry, I call myself an American. I don't claim D or R anymore because I truly believe both parties have left me. Very little of the Republican Party actually stands for and has a backbone on the fundamental rights as American that I believe on. And I think the problem with the Republican Party is they say they do, but then they go to Washington and they don't do anything different, really, than the Democrats. It's just a go along to get along. And I think George Carlin really, truly said it best. It's a big club and you ain't in it. And it's groups like you that help beat down in this big club mentality that there is in Washington.
Well, I think that's why hunters need to be engaged. That's kind of gets back to the point.
The apathy part, I think, is how we got here. And really, what I was trying to get back to is, all these things happen and we're not engaged. And if we're not engaged, they will walk all over us at some point here in the future because they will just beat us down to the point that there's not enough people left.
Yeah, that's why I would encourage hunters to become involved and involved in Gun Owners of America. Pay attention to these issues. Understand these issues, be prepared to, be part of the effort to fight for our rights. There's a lot of ways people can do that. Obviously they can join our organization. We keep people informed to the best extent we can. Guys and gals can start local groups to work on these Second Amendment issues. They can volunteer to help us. They can write and call their elected officials, demand they protect and defend the Second Amendment and our American hunting traditions. So there's a lot people can do, and that's part of this, Gun Owners of America's Second Amendment Hunters Program, is getting hunters more engaged, more involved.
Is there some resources that you guys are offering for us to, start these local groups?
Well, the first thing they probably should do is check out our website at gunowners.org. And if you go there, on the left-hand side of the page, down on the lower left, there is a heading called Second Amendment Hunters. And you can click on that. It's like a accordion site with resources, legislative action, events, hunting partners, videos, donate. Obviously, they can donate if they wish to, but this will get them informed and engaged about some of the things going on. There's a legislative action part here that talks about us rebuking that petition last summer where the groups tried to stop, hunting across state lines. That's the best place to start. There's an action center where they can get alerts about things that are happening in their part of the country. So, we send out information to, you don't even have to be a member actually to sign up for our alerts. Those are free. So people can really start at our website and go there to Second Amendment Hunters.
It is a great resource. I do have it up right now, and just scrolling through it, it's put together well. And if you just go there to, like you said, the Second Amendment Hunters tab, you got everything there that you have. I mean, you click a couple clicks and you're on their YouTube. There's a few other podcasts that people could listen to.
Hey, Brian, we need to get you in our partners page there as your podcast. We'll work on that offline.
Hey, that would be great if you could, but it's not 100% needed on my part. I really personally, truly believe in the message that you guys have. And like I said earlier in the show, I had an issue with the NRA a few years ago, and I found you guys, and I've been supporting you guys ever since. And I really, truly appreciate what you're doing, because I think that you've done more for me in the dollars I've spent than the NRA has. So I wanted to highlight you guys. And then, of course, I got your newsletter and you were in it. So it was just perfect timing.
Yeah. Well,
especially with the, like you said, the administration and this death by a thousand cuts, that's kind of been the progression of the last 30 years of the political arena around guns and all the issues. It's people don't understand that our government won't. There is a mantra: you cannot let any good crisis go to waste. And every time there's one of these incidents with a gun, the media ramps up, and it's the same mantra, and they don't stop. And it's groups and organizations like you guys. So when I go to sleep, you guys are still working on this stuff, and it's my dollars that help that. And I can't encourage hunters enough to be involved in this. And I don't care if you don't think people need AR-15s. They're going to come for your shotgun at some point, and the guy that AR-15's gone, he's not going to stand with you anymore because you didn't stand with him. That is a fundamental thing that needs to happen here as we move forward as our community. And I truly think there's a lot of gun owners that aren't hunters, that if hunters were more involved, we could turn them into hunters. And I truly think that that's a big opportunity for the hunting community moving forward.
Absolutely. And to your point, gun control's a slippery slope. The hunters in Australia and Great Britain, I don't think they thought 30 years ago we would be where we are now in those countries. They started giving up.
Absolutely not. They all can look back and say that. All can.
Yeah, they started giving up.
How many warnings do you need to hear from people in Canada and Australia that this would have never happened if we didn't give our guns up? I mean, those people are out there. You can listen to what they have to say if you want to.
Well, and the common man in most other countries has effectively been disarmed. I mean, you some of them still have access to double barrel shotguns or bolt action rifles. They often have to keep them locked away and can only take them out when they're going hunting and things like that.
And it becomes really way expensive.
Well, they got to have federal tax stamps and all kind of paperwork, and they can get.
Well, and the beauty again of your organization is you're not just fighting about guns, because you understand it's not just about guns, because they're not going to come after just the gun. They're coming after our opportunities out there in the wildlife space as well. And that's just the beauty of all of this, is you guys are bringing a holistic approach that I truly think is much different than a lot of other organizations.
Yeah. Yeah, we're trying to educate hunters, get hunters to set aside differences, whether you hunt with the birds with a shotgun or predators with an AR-15. We all kind of need to be on the same team to protect all our rights.
Man,
And
that's going to be a tough one, man. You got guys that have dogs, certain breeds that don't want to hunt together. How are you going to bring guys that have side by sides and over unders together?
yeah, I know.
That was a joke, but you know,
Well,
it's true though, because we do segment ourselves that way, and we have to break this down and go, you know, we are all on the same team of something, right?
well, we are, and we just need to look at these other countries and the bad things that have happened there. If we don't believe it, we had better set aside our differences, work together, um, and it's long past time. And I've seen it in my career. Actually, I've seen hunters become more engaged and become more involved and start understanding the threats to their rights more than they did 30 years ago. But we need now to be more organized and more politically targeted. We need to bring the hunters along that haven't joined this effort, and then we need to do a better job of the way we impact the political process. And I think we can do that. But it doesn't happen overnight.
It doesn't, and we have to all remember as hunters that, you know, while we're sitting in the deer stand or out there kicking dust on the prairie, or hell, even sitting in the fishing boat, there are people who don't have these hobbies, and who don't have those hobbies, they typically are working with that time to organize against the fundamental rights that allow you the opportunity to do those things. So we have to engage at this point, because the other side, the people who are trying to take these rights away, are much further down the road in organization and mobilization on these issues. And you can just see it as any one of these issues come to the forefront. You know, one of the greatest things that I've heard said, that I think is one of the most true today, is the truth, or the truth doesn't even have his pants on before the lie gets halfway around the world, is I think somehow the way it goes. Or we just have to be ready to be able to mobilize on all fronts, and it's very difficult if we're all fragmented and not together on this specific issue.
Absolutely. Yeah. There's never been a more critical time in our nation's history for gun owners and hunters. And we all need to stand together if we're going to protect those American traditions.
So what else you got in kind of closing here? And then I got a couple questions about bird hunting out there that I'd like to wrap up with, if you have a couple minutes.
Sure. You know, I guess my main message to the listeners is just what we recognize, you know, the Second Amendment's not about hunting. You know, the Second Amendment's about God-given rights and ability to protect yourself and your family. But hunters had better start getting engaged in the Second Amendment debate, because everybody's rights are under attack, both our rights to own firearms and our rights to hunt. And so we had better all band together, traditional gun owners, hunters. Sometimes they're the people, or both, but you know, we'd all better band together and work together to protect these, you know, these American traditions. That's my message to everybody.
I can't agree more. Now is the time. Now is the precipice. And unfortunately, I think over the next decade, we're going to see either a big change in our country fundamentally, or we're going to see a restoration of kind of our constitutional fundamental rights. It's going to happen. It just, I don't know, maybe I got a sixth sense or something, but I could just feel it, that the rhetoric and the polarization is worse than I've ever seen it. And I've only been on this planet not that long. And when I talk to people who are older than myself, the impression I get is that it now is the time, and we need to band together and stand for something.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. No, I agree.
So how was your bird hunting season last year? You're out in Wyoming, and you did mention Kansas. You go down to Kansas to chase quail?
Yeah,
and some pheasants?
Kansas for quail and pheasants, and the Dakotas for pheasants and sharp-tails and huns, and here in Wyoming, some blue grouse and some huns and some chuckers. So it was not a bad year. It was a diverse year, I guess. Found lots of species in different places. Some of the total numbers of birds weren't as high as in some years. Had drought has been a big problem in the northern plains and northern Rockies in many areas for a number of years, and that's had an impact on bird populations. They're not as abundant in some places as they normally are, but there's still birds out there if you're willing to wear out some shoe leather and and work hard. So it wasn't a bad year.
What time of year do you head to Kansas?
This year it was right before December, before Christmas, and some other years I've gone in January. This year we got to go down there in December for a few days, and it was problem.
It was dry. It was very dry.
It was dry. It was dry.
I don't know what part of the state you're in. I hunted a little bit in November, and then went back in early December, and then January again. And this was the most I hunted in Kansas ever, and I burned a lot of boot tread and tire tread. And there were pockets that were exceptional, but there were pockets, and normally it's more regional.
Yeah. I tell you, I hunted all over Wyoming. I hunted some spots in Kansas, and I hunted some spots in the Dakotas, and everywhere I hunted was dry. It was a drought. Yeah. I mean, it's dry country, but I mean, everywhere I hunted was having a drought.
Oh yeah, no, there was no when I meant pockets, I meant pockets of birds.
Yeah, there were some. There was no
real pockets of what I would call normal conditions.
Yeah, and I hope we get rain. I hope that cycle changes, because that in the West, as most of your listeners probably know, sometimes we have habitat, but we got to have rain to make that habitat productive. Mm-hmm. And a little different than back east, where I would argue most of the time you don't have very good habitat. Doesn't matter how much it rains in some areas of the Southeast, at least. But,
yeah, I wouldn't argue with that generalization.
Yeah, but in the West, moisture is just so critical, and that's one of the things you certainly can't control. We can't control the weather, at least not yet. And so, pray for rain in the northern Rockies and Plains states if you like upland bird populations.
Yeah, have you been having decent rain this spring? I've been kind of paying attention to more of the Dakotas, and it doesn't look fantastic, but we've been in a cycle here where, at least here in the Midwest, we've got a little bit of a more traditional spring, which I don't like.
No,
suicide gray is not a color I'm
Wyoming is still very dry, and we didn't have a lot of snow this winter. I'm hoping, because sometimes we get significant snow in April, I'm hoping we get some big snows before our opportunities are gone this season. But we have not had a lot of snow, and it's not shaping up good in Wyoming. Hopefully the Dakotas will be a little better. Certainly from a pheasant perspective and everything, that would be nice. And, the other factor I'm sure that you and your listeners know is that we've lost so much CRP in the Dakotas and the Plains states over the last 10, 12 years. That's had a big impact on bird populations. And
row crop just doesn't produce birds.
Yeah, well, boy, I tell you, the heydays of pheasant hunting, at least in my lifetime, were about 15 years ago. And that coincided with some of the peaks in CRP acreages out in a lot of those states. And
sure.
I remember, I believe in 2008, North Dakota had 3.4 million acres of CRP. Now they have 1 million, roughly. These are rough numbers. That's a pretty significant drop.
It's a 2/3 reduction. 60% roughly.
A lot of states have seen a similar situation. So we've lost a lot of habitat for birds in some of the states that are CRP dependent. Now, nice thing about a bird like a hunt or a chucker in the more into the Rockies and Great Basin, they're not they're not CRP dependent. They're living on rangeland, so that's kind of nice. But boy, the birds that are CRP dependent in the middle of the country in the plain states, they're taking it on the chin.
Yeah, and you throw the drought conditions in on top of that, and it hasn't been a good recipe. We'll see. There's Pheasants Forever's been putting in a lot of work, and Quail Forever has too. With hopefully see some enrollments here over the next course. I mean, by me in Wisconsin, I'll be terribly honest. There's a fair amount of people who are putting their land in a CRP, and I'm seeing more and more tall grass, native kind of oak savanna, prairie kind of stuff being put in, which is very promising. I have my place over there. I can get up in the morning, I can hear roosters cackle and crows. So it's nice, but it's a pocket. And unfortunately, when it comes to our uplands with postage stamp kind of landscape, doesn't really work. We need much larger scale habitat structures and space available. And it's, when you talk about 60% reduction, it's a tough deal.
Absolutely.
That's 60% less habitat, and that also means 60% less opportunities for you as a hunter to go hunt too. I mean, there's just less space.
Exactly.
You got more hunters. It's a complex problem. So
yeah. No.
Well, Mark, I don't have anything else to discuss with you. There's a lot we could get into the rabbit hole on, but we've been going a little bit longer than probably needed to today, and for your sake. And I think we'll have you back on the show. I want to get into that quail debate.
Yeah,
I would really love to hear what you guys had to publish that.
Love to come back and talk to you about that specific issue and quail, and
we can talk about some GOA stuff too then.
GOA stuff, and we can talk more about that as well. Love to do it, Brian. I've enjoyed being on your show, and I hope your members have enjoyed it. Love to come back sometime.
Oh, absolutely. It's been a pleasure talking to you here today, and I always love when we end the podcasts and there's a lot more that we could discuss. I hope we discussed enough for the listeners today, and I can't encourage them more. I will encourage them a lot more. Let me rephrase that. They need to go out and join GOA. You guys are, my opinion, out there, the best gun owners and Second Amendment group out there today. And just in everybody who has left the NRA out of disgust or not happy with them and all the other stuff, they need, or if you're not, I'm very disappointed you're not part of GOA already. So get out there and join. You guys are not terribly expensive to get an annual membership to, and I think you do a lot with the money, and it's a great resource. And I'm super excited to see you guys kind of put on this initiative to bring in the hunting community. I told you earlier that we're all in our silos, and all these little habitat groups really don't want to touch this Second Amendment issue, and I think you guys are going to do a great job and hopefully help bridge that gap for a lot of folks.
Well, that's our goal, and I appreciate your support for Gun Owners of America, and we welcome your listeners to check us out and work with us, and try to work collectively, to protect our hunting traditions and our Second Amendment rights.
Awesome, Mark. We'll definitely have you back on here shortly, and thanks again. I thought it was rather appropriate to play a little bit of patriotic music here towards the end of today's show. I'm going to encourage you to join Gun Owners of America. They've done more responsible spending and have been a hell of a lot more active. And I feel that my dollars as a contributor to their organization go a hell of a lot farther than the National Rifle Association. Consider joining Gun Owners of America. I want to thank everybody for sticking into the end of episode 51. Please check out patreon.com/amazingoutdoors. Like I said earlier, I still have a few hats. I want to give them to some of these listeners. I'm not even getting my hat cost or the shipping covered for the $5 I'm asking you for. So let me get you this hat for $5. Join the community, get early access to these episodes. You could have been listening to this a week earlier. God bless you. God bless America. God bless this country. We need to band together as Americans. Forget the party lines. And most of all, tight lines. Shoot straight. Get out there. I am Brian Mays, and I am out of here for today. Thank you for listening to the Amazing Outdoors podcast.